Hello everybody and welcome to the Moose Trail. I'm your host, Chris the Moose Johnson, and today we got a very packed episode for you as always, and that is going to be including the Hot Hierarchy with Will Lewin and Kyle Sparrow's sensational fantasy breakdown on top of me breaking down the NFL and what's going on this week. Shout out to Jake. He couldn't make it. He's not feeling too hot, but hey, that's all good. We're going to have a great episode nonetheless, and Will, we'll send it to you.
Thank you, Moose, and welcome back, everyone, to the Hot Hierarchy. I'm, of course, your host, Will Lewin, and we finally made it to the college football playoff rankings, and the committee were terrible. They did a horrible job of coming up with the top 25 for the first ever 12-team playoff bracket in the college football world. But don't fret. That's what I'm here for. That's what the Hot Hierarchy is here for. We're here to make all the changes, adjust all the errors that the committee make, and form my own brand new Hot Hierarchical top 25. That's right. We're not going to see teams going up and down in the rankings. We've started brand new here on the Moose Trail, and we're going to go into it in just a second. But I just want to point out that next week we will have that playoff format for you guys so that you can kind of see how the 12-team bracket is going to shape up in terms of the college football playoff committee and the Hot Hierarchy. But to adjust to the changes here, we've got the same layout. Let's get right into it, talking about teams ranked 11 through 25 first. You know the drill. We're going to talk about the playoff poll this time around. First time we're seeing that in Week 11. Alabama is going to be up top at number 11 with Boise State after their great win against San Diego State at 12. SMU, great win against Pittsburgh. They're at 13. Texas A&M, brutal loss against South Carolina on the road, only at 14 though. LSU finds themselves in the top 25 in the college football playoff poll. Then Ole Miss with a great win against Arkansas, only finds themselves at 16. Iowa State, not a great time for them over the weekend against Texas Tech, is at 17. Pittsburgh, again, we already talked about the loss to SMU. They're at 18. Kansas State, 19 after their loss to Houston. Not really sure why they're still in the top 25. Colorado, Washington State, 2 bye weeks. They're at 20 and 21. Louisville at 22 after their great win against Clemson. They're the first 3-loss team in not only the AP poll, but the college football playoff poll as well. Then Clemson, as we were just talking about them, right below them, Missouri, and an undefeated Army team. Going to round things out here for teams ranked 11 through 25. Going through it, Boise State, what they should be doing against San Diego State, but I feel like there is some inferred value with the Broncos, and we'll be talking about that in just a second. SMU, dominant win against Pittsburgh. They belong to be right there at 13. Texas A&M, I'm not so sure about them being at 14, as well as LSU. I'm not so sure about them being in the rankings at all, to be honest. The same thing goes for Kansas State as well. And then Louisville at the bottom there, just a great win against Clemson. But speaking of a 3-loss team, I feel like you can't have one 3-loss team without the other, and that's exactly why South Carolina is in my rankings right there at the 22 spot, higher than Louisville after their win against Texas A&M. Meanwhile, Texas A&M still finds themselves at the 20 spot here for me in the Hot Hierarchy. Not to mention that just above them are Louisiana and Tulane. They're going to be in the Hot Hierarchy. We're going to talk about them in just a second. I've got Ole Miss at the 12th spot. Me and the playoff poll, both have Alabama at 11. Then SMU at 13. That's a correct spot to have them at. But I have Army all the way at 14. Compared to 25, it's been a recurring theme about undefeated teams not really getting enough credit where credit is due in the rankings, and I feel like Army is certainly struggling with that the most. Then Iowa State, yes, they did lose to Texas Tech, but you'll see here in just a second that they only lost by 1 point, and I feel like the weather was a huge reason for why they lost that game. Definitely some crazy weather down there in Lubbock for the Red Raiders, but the fact that the game was at Iowa, I don't think they're kind of expecting that kind of weather this early in the year. Caught the Cyclones napping, but we look towards Texas A&M and South Carolina as we talk about some scores. 44-20 at home. You can't ask for a better performance from the South Carolina Gamecocks, and that's exactly why they're in my rankings as well. As well as Louisville, they did a great job handling the Clemson Tigers at home and Dabo Swinney's team, but they do have a rough go of it the rest of the season. We'll be talking about that in just a second. Again, we already mentioned Kansas State and LSU not being in the Hot Hierarchy. I just don't see any value in them whatsoever. But Ole Miss with a dominant performance getting that win 63-31 against Arkansas on the road, where Arkansas has really prevailed to be one of the dominant home teams this season, especially in the SEC. They make an absolute mockery of them. Lane Kiffin certainly happy with his team this week. And Army, they do beat Air Force by a score of 20-3, but it is important to know that Army, playing without their starting quarterback last weekend, we hope that he's going to be suiting up next week so the Army Black Knights can really hone in to getting into the 12-team playoff bracket. Now, looking over to next week, we've got Alabama on the road to LSU. That's going to be a very crucial matchup in the SEC, as both of those teams are looking to get into the top 10, even though I don't think LSU is going to come anywhere close to winning this game. Speaking of very good matchups, Ole Miss against Georgia. Now, this is exactly why I have Ole Miss over here at 12, because if they do manage to get that win against the Bulldogs, it is much easier to put them not only from 12 into the top 10, but put them ahead of Georgia into the top 10. Depending on how that game goes is really dependent on whether or not a 2-loss Georgia team belongs in the top 10 regardless. But at the bottom there, we do have UNLV. I just want to talk about this for a second. UNLV on the road against Hawaii, 3-hour difference. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2, UNLV coming off of a bye week. Problem number 3, we just set the clocks back an hour, and I feel like the time management in all of this and the sleep schedule for some of the players could definitely be out of the ordinary for them, and it might be a closer game than what a lot of people are thinking. Hawaii have caught a lot of teams sleeping at home so far this season, and I don't think UNLV are an exception to that statistic. We've got Washington State taking on Utah State, and then South Carolina on the road against Vanderbilt. They are identical teams in the SEC, and that's going to be a nice segment over to the On the Block segment right before I mention the fact that Louisiana are going to be playing Arkansas State at home. That's going to be an interesting Sun Belt matchup. We'll see how that goes, as well as Tulane playing Temple, But On the Block is going to be South Carolina. They're number 1 on the block. Now, they got that great win against Texas A&M, as you can see right here. They also have a really good win on the road against Oklahoma. And then Alabama, not the greatest loss ever, but holding them to 27 points and on the road is certainly something exceptional for the Gamecocks. If that was a home game, I don't doubt that the Gamecocks would have won that game. So South Carolina on the block for me because they're not in the playoff poll. But speaking of teams that aren't even in the playoff poll, but in the hot hierarchy, the San Jose State Spartans. Now, you're going to look at this graphic right here, and you're going to see that they lost to Fresno State, they beat Wyoming at home, and they lost to Colorado State. Now, San Jose State at home is the scary part for me, and they face Boise State and UNLV at home before the season is over, and I feel like that is going to pay huge dividends in the race for not only the Mountain West Conference title, but that 12th team in the 12-team playoff bracket. As we mentioned before, the champion of the highest ranked conference goes on to that 12-team bracket, but we will be providing that bracket next week. Now, to quickly move on to the 3rd team, it's going to be Vanderbilt. Again, we just mentioned how Vanderbilt and South Carolina are going to be matching up this weekend, but Vanderbilt did have a really good win against Auburn on the road, 17-7. They held Texas to 27 points and only lost to them by 3. And that Ball State game, we don't really have to worry about that, but it's the Alabama game before that really is playing dividends for the Commodores as they beat the Crimson Tide at home. Again, Vanderbilt has been a really good team in recent weeks, but that game against Georgia State, I just can't get it out of my system yet, and that's the big thing why they're not in the hot hierarchy. Now, moving on to the 4th team, it's going to be JMU. Again, JMU, kind of a team that's been forgotten about. You surely weren't expecting to see them here in the On the Block segment, but they've got that win against Southern Mississippi, and then they've got the Georgia Southern loss, which really doesn't help them at all, but it's the home games for JMU and the Dukes that are really getting the job done for them this season, I feel like, so far. And we look back to that win they had against North Carolina, 70-50. I don't think we should be forgetting about that either, but yet people are. I feel like it's too soon to count out these kinds of teams. Speaking of these kinds of teams, Western Kentucky, definitely another team you didn't have on your bingo card, but I've got them as the 5th team here on the block. They just beat Kennesaw State, nothing to write home about, but Sam Houston and UTEP, definitely 2 interesting matchups, but Western Kentucky handling business. I think the reason why they've been written off so quickly thus far is because they had that abysmal loss to Alabama at the beginning of the season, but the Hilltoppers are nothing to joke joke around with, they do have a chance in their respective conference to really make a name for themselves and potentially make their way into the rankings as well. But the most important part of the show, it's the top 10. We're going to quickly go through things here. Starting at number 1 for the playoff poll is going to be the Oregon Ducks, as they should be. Ohio State 2, Georgia 3, Miami 4, then Texas, Penn State, Tennessee, Indiana. Indiana finally in the top 10 as an undefeated team, as well as BYU still undefeated and in the top 10. Notre Dame going to be making up that 10 spot. I feel like the playoff committee definitely sees the same kind of value in Notre Dame that I do. It's definitely exciting to see them there. Ohio State in that Penn State game, not as a scoring blowout as I thought it would be, and that's exactly the reason why I don't have Ohio State at 2. Let's take a look at the hot hierarchy. Instead, I have Ohio State all the way at 7. Miami's 2, Indiana's 3, Texas 4, Notre Dame 5, Georgia 6. Then bouncing over, we've got Tennessee at 8, BYU 9, and Penn State 10. Now, the reason why for these Penn State and Ohio State rankings, as you can see right here, is mainly because of the score. Not a great game between the Nittany Lions and the Buckeyes, a score of 20-13, and the Nittany Lions had a chance to win the game at the end there, but coming up short. They also had so many opportunities on top of that. But Notre Dame at number 5, again, I can forgive that NIU loss at this point. The Huskies of Northern Illinois just caught the Fighting Irish on a bad day, in my point of view, but they're certainly moving up in the hot hierarchy. Speaking of teams moving up in the hot hierarchy, I think it's about time we give Indiana the credit where credit is due. They just scored 47 against Michigan State, and when you compare that to Oregon, who only scored 30 points against Michigan State, that certainly is something to hone in. Not only that, but Indiana next week, as you're going to see here, are going to be taking on none other than Michigan next week, which is the same team that Oregon just pummeled on the road. So I would be very interested to see how many points Indiana can score in this home game against Michigan, as that will really determine how good they are as a football program, and the fact that people really need to stop taking them for granted week in and week out. Taking another closer look at this, again, Penn State at the bottom there. They've got Washington at home, and then Ohio State, a little bit of a bye week with Purdue at home as well. But again, Georgia at Ole Miss is going to be so crucial. Again, them in that 3 spot over here for the playoff poll is going to be very hard for them to move down, and especially they should be moving down to an Ole Miss team that has been red hot in recent weeks. So I feel like that's why I have them at number 6 right here, but them at number 3 here for the playoff poll is really going to be so hard for the committee to move Ole Miss in front of Georgia, especially when they're all the way down at 16. At that point, you're going to need to move them up 10 spots. I don't think that's really happening. But before we leave here, I just want to show you this. And this is exactly the reason why the hot hierarchy exists. Now, we're looking at the playoff poll and the AP poll for Week 11. As you can see, there is only one difference, and that is Georgia and Ohio State have flipped spots. I didn't bring it up in this graphic, but if you look further into it, you look at teams ranked 11 through 17, the AP poll only has one additional switch, and that's between LSU and Texas A&M, and I don't even feel like LSU should be in the rankings. But this kind of behavior and the kind of acts that we see from the committee and the AP poll year in and year out is disgusting in my eyes. We shouldn't be seeing this kind of thing where it is identical. I mean, this is exactly the same as this. There are little differences here. I don't get why we're vouching for a team like Ohio State that has now had 3 close Big Ten games. Meanwhile, Indiana is at the bottom there at 8, while they have been handling business all season long. It's about time that the committee woke up and realized that it's not about the team that's going to get you the most views, because sometimes those teams aren't the best teams. What college football is about good teams being ahead of bad teams. Not bad teams that get a lot of viewerships ahead of good teams that get no viewership. I'm sick of it, but that's going to be it for me and my little rant this week. We're sending it over to Jake, who's talking about the Heisman. Thanks for tuning in to the Hot Hierarchy this week. We'll see you next week where we've got that playoff bracket format for you. Take it away.
Thanks, guys. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another week of Sparrow's Sensational Fantasy Picks. I'm your host, Kyle Sparrow. And last week I didn't do too well on picks, but we're back again this week. And I think I got some better picks for you guys. Starting out this slate, we got Joe Burrow, became the number 5 fantasy ranked quarterback after Week 9 with 29.14 points against the Raiders in Week 8, 251 yards passing, and 5 touchdowns this week. Projected just over 20 points next week against Baltimore. And it's a rematch of a very thrilling game that ended in overtime where Lamar Jackson went nuclear. And I think Joe Burrow is going to do the same. So beware of that nuclear fantasy week for him. I have him as a stardom due to that crucial matchup. Next up, we got Patrick Mahomes, who had a really good game this Monday against Tampa Bay. Became the number 17 ranked quarterback after Week 9. 24.54 points against Tampa Bay. Just under 300 yards passing and 291 yards. Fantasy points again, these 3 touchdowns equivalent to all those fantasy points. Projected just over 14 points, Week 10 against the Denver Broncos. And he had a pretty good performance this Monday night. Kind of had to get going at the end, but went into overtime and they won. But I do have him as a sit-in because Patrick Mahomes is normally not a good fantasy quarterback, as he's not really a scrambling quarterback, but he's really good throwing. And this guy was on here for the past 2 weeks, and he's back again this week. I mean, it's Jalen Hurts, number 6 fantasy quarterback after Week 9 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Had just under 30 points against the Jags. 230 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, and rushing, 13 carries for 67 yards and a touchdown. Projected just over 22 points, Week 10 against Dallas. And he's coming into his own. I think Jalen Hurts and the Eagles are firing on all cylinders, and he's dangerous on the ground. I mean, with his feet and the tush push, he gets a lot of rushing touchdowns, which count directly towards his fantasy count. I have him as a stardom due to that Jacksonville defense. Kind of not really. Jacksonville didn't really test him that much. Dallas is going to be a divisional matchup, but Dallas is pretty banged up right now. Next up, Zay Flowers, who had kind of an underrated performance this week. He became the number 9 fantasy wide receiver after Week 9 against the Denver Broncos. 29.7 points, 5 receptions, 127 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And he had a good Week 2-week performance so far, and I think he's gotten over 15 points these past 2 weeks. I have him as a stardom. With Rashad Bateman, yes, that is the wide receiver 1, but Zay Flowers is also a very, very, very good target, as he can also run those deep routes, and he's just behind Rashad Bateman in the wide receiver room. Next up, this guy had an amazing week. Garrett Wilson became the number 3 ranked wide receiver after Week 9. Got 30 points against Houston, 9 receptions, 90 yards, and 2 touchdowns, and had one of the best catches I've ever seen. Barely got a shin in for the touchdown. Projected 17.5 points, Week 10 against Arizona. As I said before, best catch of the week, and his contested catches are his specialty. They have Devontae Adams, who is a good deep route runner, but Garrett Wilson is also those little drag routes. He's also elusive. I have him as a stardom, as I think Aaron Rodgers is going to target him more after that performance. Moving on, DeAndre Hopkins with his new team, the Kansas City Chiefs, coming over from the Tennessee Titans. Number 57 ranked wide receiver after Week 9. Now, don't let those numbers fool you. He had 28.6 points against Tampa Bay, 8 receptions, 86 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He's projected just over 11.5 points against Denver. And he's starting to adjust with the Chiefs. I think he had his first big game with the new team, and I think he's going to continue as Patrick Mahomes now looks at him as a deep threat, as they don't really have a wide receiver 1. Yes, they have Xavier Worthy, who's really good and fast, but Travis Kelce is their primary catch targeter, and I think DeAndre Hopkins is coming into his own in this Chiefs. I have him as a stardom. I think he's only going to rise. And this guy also had another really good week, another receiver, Jackson Smith-Njigba, number 14 ranked wide receiver after Week 9, 37 points against the LA Rams, 180 yards, 2 touchdowns. He was clearly Geno's favorite target this week. He does have a bye week next week against San Francisco in Week 11. And he had an underrated performance. I don't think he really came into his own this week, as Geno Smith had to target him more. Tyler Lockett was kind of getting looked at a lot by that defense. I have him as a sit-him, though, because this is his first boom in a while. I think Geno Smith is going to look for DK more as DK comes back after the bye week. Plus, they play San Francisco. Yes, they are banged up, but San Francisco is also starting to get healthy. Christian McCaffrey's almost coming back, and Deebo Samuel is back as well. And tight ends now, Mike Gesicki. Really random fantasy boom this week. He became the number 13 ranked tight end after Week 9, 27 points versus the Raiders, 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, where you get your 12 fantasy points. He's been pretty decent lately. I mean, he's only projected 8.4 points Week 10 versus Baltimore, but I have him as a sit-him. That Baltimore defense is really good, and we saw that last game between Baltimore and Cincinnati. It was kind of really not a tight end game for the Cincinnati Bengals. It was more a wide receiver game. That's why I got him as a sit-him. Travis Kelce up next. He was here last week. He's here again this week. Had another 20-plus point week. Became the number 5 ranked tight end after Week 9. And he had 100 yards, receiving 0 touchdowns, but those receptions, 14 receptions. He's projected just over 12.5 points at 12.8 points against Denver. And receptions equals points. I mean, he had 14 receptions, which if you play PPR, you know how many points that is. I have him as a stardom, obviously. Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, they're undefeated together. And we're really starting to see the connection build. Moving on to running backs, we have Devon Achane, who had surprisingly a really good week, even though the Dolphins lost to the Buffalo Bills. Became the number 8 ranked running back after week 9. 32.1 points against Buffalo. He had 12 carries for 63 yards and 1 touchdown on the ground. And he had 8 receptions for 28 yards and a touchdown receiving. He's projected 18.9 points week 10 versus the LA Rams. And he's the running back 1 in Miami. There's no doubt about that. They have Raheem Mostert, but they don't really use him as much. I have him as a stardom, Devon Achane. He's good out of the backfield, and he's really good running as well. And finally on this list, we have Saquon Barkley, who also went off this week. Number 3 ranked running back after week 9. 32.9 points, so close to 33 points against Jacksonville. 27 carries for 159 yards and a touchdown, and he had 3 receptions for 40 yards and a touchdown receiving. He's only projected just over 20 points against Dallas, which is a pivotal divisional matchup. He's listed as questionable. I think he'll be healthy going into the week 10. Start him if he's healthy. I think Jalen Hurts is kind of trusting Saquon Barkley a bit more as he just moved over from the Giants. Saquon Barkley is really good. We saw him do that insane hurdle, the backwards hurdle, and it was amazing to watch. But yeah, that's all I have for you guys this week on Sparrow's sensational fantasy picks, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for a great breakdown from the fantasy perspective. I'm sure all of our fantasy football watchers are enjoying that as always. Good predictions this week. I think they're going to hit. But let's get into the actual NFL recap this week and talk about what's going on with the standings and how the NFL is going because, look, there's a lot going on. And then we're going to get started right now. We're going to go over to the Kansas City Chiefs as they are chasing perfection as the surprising team, and the Pittsburgh Steelers are in the top 10 of this still this week, this deep into the year. I mean, we didn't think Russell Wilson or Justin Fields were going to get them to this point, but hey, they're proving everybody wrong, and they're doing really well. They're staying in the top 10. But we're going to the backside, and look, the Raiders, they're tied right now for the first overall pick in the NFL draft with the Giants, Saints, Patriots, Browns, and Jaguars on top of the Panthers. So we can see what they can do. It's not looking too hot for all those teams right now as they're tied for last place in the NFL, but we can see what they can do moving forward. The team's not looking too hot. But let's get into some actual team games because we got a lot of very exciting stuff that happened this week, including the Eagles versus the Jaguars. And yes, this was such an awesome game to watch as a fan. I mean, you got to see Saquon Barkley go for 199 total yards and 2 total touchdowns. Trevor Lawrence didn't throw for any touchdowns, but he ran for 2 and he threw for 2 interceptions. The Eagles made some questionable decisions. They left about 8 points on the board with two field goals. They went for on 4th down instead of kicking the field goal, and they went for two-point conversions, so they lost 2 more points on that as well. So the Eagles left about 8 points on the board. Could have been a 36-23 game. Would have been a lot different. But looking at it like this, Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley might be one of the best backfields in the league, including Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry. They're up there. One of those two are probably the number 1 backfields right now, as Jalen Hurts and Saquon together accounted for 456 total yards and 4 touchdowns. And that doesn't even include the highlights that were flying all around this weekend with the Philadelphia Eagles in the surprising catch from Jahan Dotson that was just a bobble catch and no one thought was going to be completed, but he did, and he got it. And then you also had Devontae Smith's one-handed catch at the end of the game when they needed him to step up with A.J. Brown out of the game. Great catch by him. Nakobe Dean with the game-sealing interception at the end of the game. And, of course, the highlight everyone has seen, Saquon Barkley hurdling someone backwards. Yeah, that's right. Backwards. The Philadelphia Eagles had such an amazing time, and honestly, that was such a great game to watch. I cannot wait to see what's going to happen next. Moving forward, though, we have the Raiders and the Bengals this weekend. We have to recap what's going on with them because a lot of stuff happened with the Raiders as this loss ended up being the final straw for Antonio Pierce and his coaching staff as he decided to make some moves with some of the coaches as he fired Luke Getsy, the old offensive coordinator, the ex-coordinator, offensive coordinator for the Bears last year. Then he also fired his quarterback coach and his O-line coach. And that's massive changes, especially to those rooms. Those are 3 big changes for the offense. Then he went out and hired a new interim head offensive coordinator, Scott Turner, and he also hired former head coach of the Raiders and his dad, Norv Turner, to be a senior advisor to him to help the offense out, on top of hiring Joe Philbin to take on the O-line coaching job, which I'm absolutely in love with the new coaches that came in. I didn't like the regime that was in there for the offense for the Raiders this year with Luke Getsy. I started to really lose my faith in that team and how they were going to be able to control the ball, because they would score on every first drive, but then they wouldn't be able to score again for the rest of the game. So you cannot win football games like that. And the Raiders is a top 10 defense, but the reason why they're not really looked at like that is because they give up too many points in the game, and that's because of the offense not getting off the field in time and not giving the defense any breaks. They just get off the field instantly, and they don't score. It's hard to have faith as a defense that, hey, we got to keep this game within a 7-point game, but they haven't scored once since the first quarter. So it's hard to see that happening, and I understand the firing of those coaches and the hiring of the new ones. The Raiders are looking to save their season. Moving on. We have the defensive backs on the trade deadline, because the trade deadline was massive this year, as we have Tre'Davious White getting traded from the Rams for a 7th-round pick, and we have Marshawn Lattimore getting traded to the Washington Commanders for a 3rd, a 4th, and a 6th-round pick. That is a very interesting situation. Both teams obviously feel like their Super Bowl window is there, and they can make it, and they're obviously trying to capitalize on it because, look, the Jaden Daniels window is just opening, and the Lamar Jackson window is kind of looking like it's going to close because they haven't been able to figure it out. So we'll see if they can get this going this year. I think this is a good move for both teams, but that's not to say they won the day, because I think one team that we talked about earlier, saying that we don't know how they got to the top 10, did a classic move, and that's the Pittsburgh Steelers doing Steelers stuff, getting players they shouldn't, in my opinion, for a lot cheaper than they did. They got Preston Smith for a 7th-round pick from the Packers, turning out that he actually requested a trade out of the Packers. He's a great edge and honestly should not be getting traded for a 7th-round pick. And then Mike Williams got traded for a 5th-round pick, where the Steelers get their wide receiver 2 with George Pickens that they've been so desperately needing and could not find with anybody else, but finally got one with Mike Williams. So looking really good for the Steelers right now, and great offseason, great mid-season moves, and the Steelers are just the Steelers. They're going to continue to do what they do. They're going to continue to dominate in free agency and in trades. I don't know how they get away with some of the stuff they do, but I think both those trades are going to end up being winners, and both teams are going to look at it like, why did we trade that guy away for that much draft capital? Now we're going to move on to the playoffs, and the playoffs has a lot of great teams, as we have a lot of movement in just who's staying and who's playing who in the playoffs, not who's getting bounced out of the playoffs. So the Bills moved up to 2, and the AFC West teams moved down to 6 and 7. So they're close on getting the brink of getting into the hunt. But with the Bengals and the Jets and the Colts all trying to turn it around, I could see one of those teams getting bounced out of the playoffs, but we'll see what happens. So we're going to move on to the NFC playoffs now. And the NFC playoffs are pretty massive, as we have a lot of movement here, with the Eagles getting put in now at 6 instead of at 7. The Packers moved down to 7. The Lions are staying at 1. So are the Commanders. So are the Falcons, staying at their spot, and the Cardinals. The main teams that are switching around are 5, 6, and 7, and 8, 9, and 10. All those teams are very close to being able to be swapped in and out, and also are very close to just being bounced out of the playoffs, being put in. Who knows? The NFC West is very strong this year, as you could tell. There's 2 teams in the hunt, and there's also a team in the playoffs currently. We're going to see if they're going to try to take the NFC North title and have more teams in the playoffs than they do out of it. Currently, though, the NFC East is just down to 2 teams. The NFC South is just down to the Falcons, and the NFC North is a toss-up between all 4 teams to make the playoffs. But that's to talk about the NFC. And now we're going to be moving on to my favorite segment, the Moose versus the Machine. And that is going to be a segment where me and the Machine, aka the stat that I created, that is all the best stats in the NFL to choose who wins. And we're going to decide who is going to win this week, as we were in a deadlock last week. We're in a deadlock again this week. We tied over the weekend again. So we're just going to stay where we're at. We keep on doing what we do. we're going to see what happens. I went 11-4 this week with my losses, and that is with the Texans, the Browns, the Saints, and the Bears losing this weekend. I predicted them all to win this last week, but they ended up letting me down and not winning. But the Moose Stat disagreed, and the Moose Stat ended up giving that look for their predictions last week, and they just basically missed on the Texans and Saints as well as I did. But it got the Packers and Seahawks wrong instead, and it got the Cardinals and the Chargers right as their predictions. So as you can see, a little bit of difference from last week, but we both went 11-4. We both tied it up. Again, staying in this deadlock, which I can't believe keeps on happening, but it just keeps on happening. So we're going to go into our predictions for this week, though, and that is my predictions right here, where we're going to have a lot of disagreements between me and the Moose Stat on this one because we have 4 teams that we disagree on this week. I have what you see on the thing. We'll go into our disagreements in a second. And here's the Moose Stat right here and its disagreements, as it has all of those. I'm really interested to see what's going to happen. You can kind of guess, you can kind of gauge the differences that we have, but we're going to get into it real quick with our first game, going with the Falcons versus at the Saints, and that's who I think is going to win. It's our first disagreement of the day, with me saying that the Falcons are going to win this game. And look, Kirk Cousins is a really good quarterback in the league. I'm not the biggest fan of him, but he has a lot of talent on his offense. They don't have a lot of problems in the locker room, and the Saints right now just got rid of their head coach. There's a lot of problems in the locker room. People are tweeting left and right what's going on with Derek Carr. From their own teammates are saying that too. So the Saints just don't look really that good of a team. I don't think they're going to win that game. And the Moose Stat does, because the Moose Stat doesn't know that the head coach is going on with that. And he doesn't know the drama situation that's going on with the team. So that's what the Moose Stat predicts. But now we're going to move on to the next game, where I say the Jets are going to win versus the Cardinals in Arizona. But the Moose Stat's going to disagree with me, and that's because, look, I think Devontae Adams and Aaron Rodgers are a very dangerous pairing. I think Garrett Wilson on that team is also very dangerous. As you can see, with less pressure on him from the defense, he can make a lot of crazier catches and plays that I've never seen from him. So I'm really interested to see what Garrett Wilson does this upcoming week. I think they're going to demolish the Cardinals, but the Cardinals, I'm just not really a big fan of, or really a big believer in this year, as the Cardinals just haven't really looked that good to me, but they've been proving me wrong week in and week out with their constant comeback wins and with their young receiver in Marvin Harrison Jr. Who knows what's going to happen? This team's very scary, and they could always pull out a win, especially against the Jets. Then we have the Lions versus the Texans. Look, I'm never going to bet against the Lions. I'm never going to say the Lions aren't going to win a game this year. I'm going to be picking them every single week, because the Lions look like a damn juggernaut right now, and no one can stop them. And it's very fun to watch with what they do on the football field. And sorry, Texans, I know you're at home, but the Moose Stat agrees and says that you're going to win. I just want to see what they can do. You don't have Nico Collins. If he's coming back this week, great job, great news. I haven't heard anything about that, though, so I don't think that's coming back this week, maybe next week. But the Lions are not a team to scoff at, and they're very dangerous, so I think the Lions will be winning this game as well this weekend. But we have our last game to cover this week, as I believe the Dolphins will be winning against the Rams. I believe I picked the Dolphins 3 weeks in a row now, and I believe they have lost all 3 weeks. So not too shocking that I'm picking them again. I just have a lot of faith in Tyreek Hill. That team is really fast, and I like Mike McDaniel a lot. I'm probably holding on for way too long because the Moose Stat disagrees, and Matthew Stafford's playing lights out. He ended up winning last week in overtime, an overtime thriller, great ball, but that was just an even better catch. It's just crazy to see what they're doing. I think the Rams are a really good team, and they can really make some noise, especially if they can get in the playoffs this year. They're young. I didn't have a lot of faith in them this year really going into it, but now watching them play a few times, that defense is legit. The Aaron Donald hole or void isn't as big as you'd expect, and I think the Rams could end up pulling this out, but I do believe the Dolphins will be the ones that do it. I just know my Moose Stat disagrees with me, and I could see why. But that's all for today. That's all we have to talk about. We had a lot to go over. Thank you to everyone for listening. Thank you for the guys who worked their butts off all week long to get this stuff in. So thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'm your host, Chris the Moose Johnson, and we'll see you guys next week.